Welcome everyone to this week 3 roundup of our Jane Austen course. I'm Gillian Dow. You've been seeing me throughout the course in the videos and on the comments section of each step of the course. I hope you've been enjoying it. As I think most of you know, this course was designed a few years ago under very, very different circumstances, and it's been interesting and very heartwarming for me, for Kim, for Alison and for Alistair to see how many of you are joining us across the globe because of these exceptional circumstances with the global pandemic, because you are self-isolating or you are unwell, because you are frontline workers dealing with the virus in hospitals and in doctors' surgeries. We send you all our very best wishes. These are extremely challenging times. Austen has long served as a solace, I think, for her readers. And we got you to look in week 1 at some of the reader responses. Winston Churchill read her. He and his wife read her during the Second World War. And she was used by a whole variety of people to provide comfort, I think. She's not always comforting, of course, and I think lots of you have been drawing out in the comments throughout the course that there's an undercurrent to her novels, and that sickness and the fragility of life is very much a theme in her work, if one looks for it. We've been thinking about Sense and Sensibility a little bit. We've been thinking about the Dashwood sisters, and I wanted to remind you of this section from Sense and Sensibility. It comes after Marianne Dashwood has recovered from her illness, and she's reflecting on her attitude to the rejection by Willoughby, and she's talking to her sister Marianne. So let me read it to you. My illness has made me think. It has given me leisure and calmness for serious recollection. Long before I was enough recovered to talk, I was perfectly able to reflect. I considered the past. I saw in my own behaviour since the beginning of our acquaintance with him last autumn nothing but a series of imprudence towards myself and want of kindness to others. I saw that my own feelings had prepared my sufferings and that my want of fortitude under them had almost led me to the grave. My illness, I well knew, had been entirely brought upon myself by such negligence of my own health as I had felt even at the time to be wrong. Had I died, it would have been self-destruction. And I think these very serious passages in Austen's prose are worth dwelling on. In this case, I think several of you in the comments have talked about, well, Sense and Sensibility as a novel that exposes sense in the persona of Eleanor Dashwood versus sensibility as personified by Marianne Dashwood. But of course, Eleanor has a great deal of sensibility and Marianne has a great deal of sense. So there's lots to bring out of that nature in Austen's novels. She's not always comfortable. She's not always comforting. Thinking back to week 1, when you were thinking about education, I think lots of us, and I'm included in this, are trying to run a school from home at the moment. Here in my study, I have a little French statue of this sort of educating scene. I've got 2 of them actually that shows the gender divide we've been looking at. This poor little girl reading carefully her book at the back here has lost her head, unfortunately, but I think you can all see what's going on here. You know, this is the happy domestic scene, women educating young children, and here a nice demonstration of a gender divide here. He's broken his slate, this little boy, but this is the careful and patient little boy being educated by his tutor. If the last 2 weeks of schools being closed in the United Kingdom has taught me anything, it's that I have a great deal of sympathy for Mrs. Bennet with 5 daughters to educate at home, and appreciate much more now, I think, why she often left them to their own devices. So I think reading Austen in the current circumstances is is certainly to tell us something new about the situation we're finding ourselves in at the moment. So in week 3 of the course, we've been wanting you to think very particularly about legacy, about afterlives, about adaptation, and of course translation. And translation is a topic I'm very interested in myself, and I've worked on quite extensively myself. I'm supposed to be at the moment, and I am, writing a book about Romantic period translators. It's always interesting for me to see how many of you are very, very shocked by Isabelle de Montolieu's translation of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, and in particular the way that she changes the ending. One of you commented that this was disrespectful, and I always like to see translators themselves in this section of the course. We have someone who wrote a few days ago, "I've worked in translation, and a very important thing is to respect the essence of the original." And I think none of us would disagree. But of course, as we've been pointing out, this is not the horizon of expectations of the 18th and early 19th century reader. It was absolutely expected that a translator would change the material they were working with, and they would change it so that it would fit the horizon of expectations of their intended reader. So Isabelle de Montolieu and Jane Austen have this interesting relationship in that Montolieu clearly admires Jane Austen's prose. She's clearly a fan. In fact, you could argue that this first translation is fan fiction. But she doesn't think that Austen is untouchable, and she thinks that the changing of her ending will make it more suitable for the readers that her work is destined for. And that's certainly a different way of thinking about translation in the period. As I point out on the course, there's absolutely no sense of international copyright in the period. So Jane Austen would not have expected to get any kind of royalties, and nor would her publisher, more importantly. Now, John Murray II, who publishes Jane Austen's Emma, she moves to him for the publication of Emma after having published Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Mansfield Park elsewhere. John Murray's a leading Romantic period publisher, and he gets increasingly angry about the issue of international copyright. It's after Austen dies in the 1820s and the 1830s that he's really exercised by the fact that Parisian booksellers can do what they want with his edition of leading Romantic period authors. Lord Byron is a very good example. So Lord Byron's works are being published in Paris in English by a publisher called Galignani, the Galignani brothers, who are picking up the London editions, resetting them, publishing them in Paris for a fraction of the price. Travellers to Paris are picking them up, and Murray is losing out. He has bought the copyright from Lord Byron, and he loses out. Jane Austen is not an author with the celebrity of Lord Byron in the period. Of course she isn't, but it's very obvious that what Parisian publishers are doing is they're looking at John Murray's list, they're looking at the authors he publishes, and they're publishing them in France, and they're making money out of it. Yes, it's an interesting thing to work on, international copyright in the period. Another thing that's interesting to think about is whether translators and the original authors collaborated. In Jane Austen's case, no. She did not know Isabelle de Montolieu personally, and Isabelle de Montolieu did not consult her on any part of the translation at all. But sometimes authors did collaborate with translators. One very good example is Jane Austen's contemporary Maria Edgeworth. Her French translator was a woman called Louise Swanton Belloc, and she pitched herself as an authorized translator, and she and Maria Edgeworth collaborated on some of her translations of Edgeworth's Tales for Children and of her novel Helen. So it did happen, but in Austen's case, it did not happen. So this was an unauthorized translation that Jane Austen really knew nothing about. We got you to think in this section of the course too about discovering Austen where you are and thinking about editions. So thinking about all the editions, whether that be a translation or an edition of the original English that you have in your houses, and how publishers pitch them. There's a lot you can do online to look at different ways of packaging Austen for her readers. So from the authoritative Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press editions to cheap editions of Austen's novels that are very much marketed as fiction for women, very, very often pink jackets, very often with reference to popular culture. There are all kinds of different ways that Jane Austen has been packaged for her readers through the ages. There are a few really good books on this topic. One very recent one by Janine Barkas that looks at the lost editions of Jane Austen. I'll make sure, I've referred to it variously throughout the course, but I'll make sure that I put a link to that to those of you so that those of you who are interested in following up can do so. With translation too, I think a few of you have talked about translations that you own and the images that are used to present Austen. So the book jackets in particular. There's one very interesting set of editions by the French publishing house, 1018, that uses paintings by Rossetti to advertise Austen's fiction. So what does it mean when Austen's women are being packaged as late 19th century pre-Raphaelites, as opposed to the late 18th century, early 19th century women that they actually were? There can be some confusion there, I think, for all readers. We're also thinking a bit in terms of editions and translations. There's an interesting question about what notes a translator should add to explain it for their intended readership. So issues of the English class system are notoriously complex, and a reader in Brazil can't be expected to know the nuances of the English gentry in the early 19th century. Arguably, nor could a British reader of the 21st century. So translators and editors share, I think, a lot. They have a lot in common. They're doing the same thing for their readers to explain to them the nuances of Austen's prose. Whole section on adaptation, and I always like to see people writing about their favourite adaptation and recommending adaptations to others. Invariably, the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth and the Wet Shirt and the Lake comes out on top. But this time, for the first time, we've had an actor from one of the adaptations take the course. Someone who appeared in Patricia Rozima's Mansfield Park has been commenting. I think overall what we want you to think about is, what is an adaptation and what should it do? Is it a creative original in the way that translations, the early translations, could be? In my opinion, the best adaptations are very far from the original. We might talk about Rozima's Mansfield Park, of course, but also Clueless, that transposes the novel Emma to a very modern American setting. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it highly. It's a fun adaptation. Recently, there's been two adaptations of unfinished works by Jane Austen that really are worth catching up on and seeing, I think. Sanderson, Andrew Davis, who did the BBC 1995 adaptation, continued Austen's unfinished Sanderson, very controversially, I think. Of course, it's a very short fragment. Jane Austen died before she could complete it. It was the final work she was working on. And Andrew Davis uses her unfinished chapters to inspire his own television series. There were frustrations with it, I think, that many felt, not least because he too left the series unfinished. There was no romantic resolution at the end of the TV adaptation of Sanderson, and I think people expect a romantic resolution with Austen. Another excellent adaptation recently has been the play by Laura Wade, which is a continuation of the Watsons. Very, very clever in thinking about what it means for an author to leave something unfinished. The story of the Watsons is a different one, of course. What Austen did there was she was writing the Watsons while living in Bath, and for some reason she didn't complete it, and we're not quite sure why, and she never went back to it. And Laura Wade, in this adaptation of the Watsons, thinks very interestingly and amusingly about what happens to a writer when the characters are in control, and when you have writer's block and you can't finish something. Always very interesting too to see people's responses to the film of my interview with the then curator of the Austen House Museum, Mary Guyett, in Jane Austen's house, Jane Austen's home, the place she lived in from 1809 till shortly before her death in 1817. I've said in the comments to the course on this run, the Jane Austen House Museum and Chawton House are both closed at the moment, as so many museums and literary destinations are. They will need us when they reopen. Small museums like this depend on their visitor numbers. They depend on that crucial secondary spend. They depend on us going, visiting the museums, having tea and scones in the tea room and buying something in the shop. And I know that when this pandemic is over and they are able to open their doors again, they will welcome all of you with open arms. Those of you who live in the UK, of course, it's easy to get to. Those of you who are much further afield, plan that trip. Thinking about how to curate Austen's story and curating exhibitions that focus on Austen's life, there's always some really creative responses to this, and I enjoy reading them. One of you said, well, it's the moment to look at sickness and health in Austen's novels, and I absolutely agree. There's a lot that can be done in presenting her fiction, in presenting her characters. I hope what we've been getting across in this course is how little we actually know about Austen's life. We have her correspondence, of course, we have her novels, we have what her family wrote about her, but we have what Catherine Sutherland has called in her work on the Austen family's biographies of Aunt Jane and of Sister Jane. We don't have an unmediated response. So there's no private secret diary, there are no journals, and even in the letters, there are great gaps. So she moves to the village of Chawton in 1809, and between 1809 and 1811, there are no letters at all. And we know that she's doing a great deal of work in this period. We know that she's revising what will become Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. We know she's preparing for publication. And it's so frustrating that we don't have any answers there. And again, there's a lot that biographers can do to write into these gaps, whether the letters were destroyed by Cassandra or whether they were just lost over the years. And we simply don't know what happened to that correspondence. But the gaps are ripe for filling in, which I think is why the biography industry is such a thriving one. There are new biographies almost every year. And I've recommended quite a few throughout the course. So curating Austen's story is always an interesting way to think about how we can approach the fiction. But I think one of the frustrations for us on this course, and it's because there are so many thousands of participants each time, is that we can't do those really close readings that we would like to do. I say that in the final roundup video where we're saying goodbye to all of you. If I can encourage any of you with free time to do anything over the coming weeks, if you do have time, it's to go back to the novels themselves. Go to the letters if you haven't already read them, and go to the juvenilia. I think there's a really different side we see of Austen when we read her juvenile works. They are engaging and quite simply hilarious. And I wanted to end with a little section from one of my favourites, which is Love and Friendship. It's a little novella that really mocks the vogue for sensibility in the period, and talks very amusingly about the isolation that one of the characters, Laura, and her family find themselves in. So this is the fourth letter from Love and Friendship. Our neighbourhood was small, for it consisted only of your mother. She may probably have already told you that, being left by her parents in indigent circumstances, she had retired into Wales on economical motives. There it was our friendship first commenced. Isabel was then 21, though pleasing both in her person and manners. Between ourselves, she never possessed the 100th part of my beauty or accomplishments. Isabel had seen the world. She had passed 2 years at one of the first boarding schools in London, had spent a fortnight in Bath, and had supped one night in Southampton. Beware, my Laura, she would often say, beware of the insipid vanities and idle dissipations of the metropolis of England. Beware of the unmeaning luxuries of Bath and of the stinking fish of Southampton. Austen's gift for amusing dialogue is always there. And I think it's one of the reasons she translates so well to the screen, is that one doesn't have to do a great deal to make her characters come alive on television or on the big screen. The stinking fish of Southampton is not so present today, and Kim and I are both teach in the English department, and we would be delighted to hear from any of you who would like to join us there at some point in the future. In the meantime, I and the rest of the course team, who normally we do these roundups together, but of course this time we're in glorious isolation. But I know I speak for Kim and Alistair and Alison when I say that we wish you all the very best for your health and happiness, and we thank you for joining us.